Hi, my name is Nicole Tung. I'm a freelance photojournalist from Hong Kong, and I'm very honored to be exhibiting this year at Czech Photo. This photograph here on the bottom is a picture from the protests in Hong Kong last year that I spent several months following. These are protesters confronting the police, and they're using a brick to fire over, but the police responded with a lot of tear gas afterwards. In my exhibition, I'm showing photographs from the protests in Hong Kong last year, as well as work on the aftermath of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, which the photographs were taken over a period of about 2 or 3 years. And it's about how people came back to their villages and towns after ISIS was rooted from these places. There's also an essay about a small essay about the Rohingya refugee crisis in Bangladesh from 3 years ago, and a few additional photographs from women in conflict situations around the world. This photograph on the bottom here is a bit of a different photograph because it's very different from all of the protest pictures that I took. It is part of a protest. There were many protesters around the streets, and the police started to fire the tear gas to try to disperse them. And I happened to be in this alleyway in a working class neighborhood in Hong Kong. And I just loved that there were these neon fluorescent lights, and it's very a Hong Kong kind of scene. But it also is a bit foreboding of the future and how it's quite not a dark situation developing there. This section of the exhibition is showcasing photographs on the aftermath of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, particularly focused on the cities of Raqqa and Mosul, which were the capitals of the so-called caliphate. I was really looking at that moment between the end of a war and the beginning of what we know as peace. And I was trying to portray how people were getting on with their lives even after many years of living under a horrific regime. I wanted to also show that there was hope, even though it was amidst a lot of despair as well. This photograph on the top is showing workers, daily laborers, basically clearing the rubble from one building in Raqqa. So Raqqa was heavily bombed by the US-led coalition in order to remove ISIS from Raqqa. About 80 to 85% of the infrastructure in the city was destroyed or damaged as a result, but people were still trying to go back to their homes and to reopen their shops because they had no other choice. This section of the exhibition is showing photographs from the Rohingya refugee crisis in Bangladesh from 2017. In just a period of 6 months, nearly 1 million Rohingya refugees had fled across the border as they were escaping attacks from government forces in Burma, in Myanmar. And they basically don't have a state. They are rejected by all countries, and they don't technically have anywhere that they can call home. So at the moment, they are still living in refugee camps in very dire conditions. And now during the coronavirus pandemic, any one infection can create a catastrophe for places like refugee camps. So this photograph shows Rohingya women standing in line waiting for food aid. In the early days of the refugee crisis there, it was very difficult for anybody to get organized food aid because it was very chaotic. There were so many people and many aid organizations trying to all help at the same time, but without coordination. But I also wanted this photograph to represent how during conflicts, women are often the first ones who lose their rights and often struggle the most because they are the ones who take care of the children, of the family, but struggle to ever, find jobs if they need to find money. Many of the women, of the Rohingya women were raped, in many cases gang raped by the government forces in Myanmar as they fled, and they became separated also from their families, so they were left alone to care for the children. This photograph here on my left is from the protests in Iraq. I took this picture in Baghdad in February after many months of young Iraqis protesting against the corruption of the government and the influence of Iran and the United States in the country's politics and society. The protests are still ongoing, but coronavirus has unfortunately put a stop to many of the mass demonstrations. The photograph above is showing civilians from Mosul getting off a truck outside of the city. They were fleeing the city because of heavy fighting between the Iraqi army and ISIS. And they were being taken off the truck because they would be searched and identified against a wanted list to see if any of them were suspected members of ISIS. As you can see, there's many children and young boys amongst them. They were separated from the women who were also searched.